The coffee cup trembled in Margaret Chen's hand as she approached table 17, the porcelain rattling against the saucer in a rhythm that matched her exhausted heartbeat. It was 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday, that dead zone between lunch rush and early dinner when the Golden Lotus Diner fell into a hushed lull, filled only with the distant clatter of dishes and the hum of the ancient air conditioning unit that had been threatening to die since 1987. The afternoon light slanted through the Venetian blinds, casting prison-bar shadows across the worn linoleum floor, across the red vinyl booths with their duct-taped tiers, across the faces of the few remaining customers who lingered over cold coffee and picked at pie. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Margaret had been on her feet for 9 hours straight. Her lower back sang a familiar song of pain, a melody she'd learned to ignore the way you ignore a neighbor's barking dog or the sound of traffic on a busy street. Her shoes, discount sneakers from the outlet mall already falling apart after 3 months, squeaked against the floor with each step. She could feel the blister on her left heel had opened again, the warm dampness of blood or fluid seeping into her sock. But she smiled anyway because that's what waitresses do, because that's what survivors do, because the smile was armor and weapon both. The old man at table 17 had been sitting there for 40 minutes, nursing a single cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. Margaret had noticed him when he came in. You always noticed the ones who didn't fit the usual pattern. The Golden Lotus served a rotating cast of regulars. Construction workers grabbing lunch, elderly couples splitting the early bird special, teenagers pooling their money for fries and endless refills. But this man was different. His suit, even from across the room, spoke of money in a way that made everything else in the diner look cheaper by comparison. It was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, the kind of garment that cost more than Margaret made in a month, maybe 2 months. He sat alone, his weathered hands wrapped around the coffee cup as if seeking warmth it no longer provided. His face was a landscape of years, deep lines carved by time, sun, and sorrow. His hair, white as fresh snow, was neatly combed back from a high forehead. His eyes, when he'd first walked in, had held a distant quality, as if he were looking not at the diner but through it, into some other time, some other place where everything was different. Margaret had seen that look before. She'd seen it in her own mirror. "Can I warm that up for you, sir?" she asked, approaching with the coffee pot she'd grabbed from the warmer. Her voice was steady, professional, the practiced tone of someone who'd learned to make strangers feel comfortable while revealing nothing of herself. The old man looked up, and something shifted in his expression. His eyes, pale blue, like winter sky, focused on her face with sudden, startling intensity. His mouth opened slightly. The coffee cup slipped in his grip, and for a moment Margaret thought he might drop it entirely. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, worried she'd somehow offended him. "I didn't mean to startle you. I can come back." "Your eyes," he whispered. His voice cracked on the words, rough with emotion she couldn't identify. "My God, your eyes." Margaret froze, the coffee pot suspended in midair between them. She'd been told her eyes were distinctive, large, dark brown, almost black in certain lights, framed by thick lashes that needed no mascara. Her mother used to say they were her best feature, back when her mother was still alive, back when there was someone to notice such things. "Sir, are you all right?" Margaret set the coffee pot down on the table, concerned now. The man's face had gone pale, his hands beginning to shake. "Do you need me to call someone? What's your name?" The question came out urgent, desperate. "Please, what's your name?" "Margaret. Margaret Chen." She glanced around the diner, looking for Danny, the other server on duty, or Rick, the manager who spent most of his shift in the back office doing God knows what. The old man was scaring her now, but there was something in his face that wasn't threatening. It was anguish, pure and profound. "Chen," he repeated, as if testing the word. "Margaret Chen. How old are you, Margaret?" The question should have been invasive, inappropriate. Margaret had dealt with plenty of strange customers in her 3 years at the Golden Lotus. The ones who got too friendly, who asked too many questions, who thought a waitress's smile was an invitation. But this wasn't that. This was something else entirely. I'm 26, she said softly. Sir, you're really worrying me. Can I get you some water? Should I? His hand shot out and grabbed hers. Not roughly, not violently, but with a desperate firmness that made her gasp. His skin was papery, liver-spotted, warm against her own. His grip trembled, but it was insistent, as if he were drowning and she was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. You have my daughter's eyes, he said, and tears began streaming down his weathered cheeks. Oh God, you have Sarah's eyes. The diner seemed to contract around them, the ambient noise fading to a muffled murmur. Margaret stood frozen, her hand caught in the old man's grasp, her mind racing through possibilities. A mistake, confusion, dementia, grief making him see things that weren't there. But something in his certainty, in the recognition blazing in his face, sent a tremor through her that had nothing to do with exhaustion or low blood sugar or the accumulated stress of another double shift. I don't understand, Margaret managed. I don't know anyone named Sarah. No, he said, and his voice broke completely. No, you wouldn't. You couldn't. His other hand came up, and before Margaret could react, he was holding both of her hands in his, staring at them as if they contained answers to questions he'd been asking for decades. The scar, the crescent moon scar on your left wrist. Where did you get it? Margaret's blood turned to ice in her veins. She looked down at her wrist, at the small, pale scar she'd had for as long as she could remember. It was shaped like a tiny crescent moon, no bigger than a fingernail, positioned just above the pulse point. She'd always assumed it was from some childhood accident she couldn't recall, some fall or scrape from before her memories truly began. I've always had it, she whispered. Since I was a baby, my mother said. The old man's face crumpled. He released one of her hands to cover his own face, his shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed torn from somewhere deep inside his chest. Margaret stood paralyzed, aware now that other customers were looking, that Danny had emerged from the kitchen and was staring at table 17 with wide eyes, that this moment was spiraling into something she couldn't control. Sir, please, Margaret said, her own voice thick with unexpected emotion. Please tell me what's happening. He looked up at her, and the grief in his face was so raw it felt like looking directly at the sun. My daughter Sarah had that exact scar in that exact place. She got it from a bracelet clasp when she was 6 months old. It was distinctive. The doctors said it would probably fade, but it never did. And she had those eyes, those exact eyes, that same shade of brown that looked black in shadow. And her birthday? He stopped, swallowed hard, forced the words out. When is your birthday, Margaret? June 7th, Margaret said automatically. 1999. The old man made a sound that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a laugh. A broken thing that held equal parts agony and something that might have been joy. June 7th. Oh God. Oh my God. What happened to your daughter? Margaret asked, though part of her already knew, could feel the answer hovering in the charged air between them. She was taken, the old man said. 26 years ago. She was 3 months old. Someone took her from her crib while we slept. We searched for years, decades. The police, private investigators, psychics, anyone who might help. We never stopped looking, never stopped hoping. His grip on her hand tightened. My name is William Hartley, and I think you might be my granddaughter. The coffee pot on the table began to steam, forgotten. Somewhere in the background, a plate shattered in the kitchen. Margaret heard Danny's sharp intake of breath, heard the shuffle of customers turning to stare, felt the weight of a dozen eyes pressing against her back. But all of it seemed to happen in another dimension, on another plane of reality that had nothing to do with the earthquake splitting open inside her chest. That's impossible, she said. But even as she spoke, her mind was already racing backward through her life, through the gaps and inconsistencies she'd always accepted without question. Her mother, Rebecca Chen, who had died of cancer 4 years ago, leaving Margaret alone in the world. Her mother, who had no family, no photographs from before Margaret was born, no stories about her own childhood beyond vague references to foster care and hardship. Her mother, who loved her fiercely but who sometimes looked at Margaret with an expression that might have been guilt, might have been fear, might have been the constant terror of losing something precious that had never truly been hers. "I need you to listen to me," William Hartley said, leaning forward with an intensity that was almost frightening. "I know how this sounds. I know you have no reason to believe me. But I'm a wealthy man, Margaret. My wife Catherine and I built Hartley Industries from nothing. We manufacture medical equipment, surgical instruments. We're worth billions. When Sarah was taken, we offered a $5 million reward. We never stopped looking. We never gave up hope, even after Catherine died 5 years ago. She died not knowing, Margaret. She died still hoping." Margaret's legs felt weak. She pulled out the chair across from William Hartley and sat down without asking permission, without caring that she was still on shift, that Rick would yell at her if he saw her sitting with a customer. None of that mattered. Nothing mattered except the impossible thing taking shape between them. A possibility so enormous and so terrifying that she couldn't yet wrap her mind around it. "This is crazy," she said. "People don't just... Things like this don't happen in real life." "They do," William insisted. "They're rare, but they do. There have been cases, children reunited with their families after decades. DNA testing now, it's a miracle. We can know for certain. Please, Margaret, please just consider the possibility." Margaret thought about her mother, about the woman who'd raised her in a series of small apartments, always moving, always looking over her shoulder. Rebecca Chen, who'd worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat, who'd been both mother and father, who'd given everything she had and then some. Rebecca, who'd cried when Margaret asked about baby pictures and said they'd been lost in a fire. Rebecca, who'd had no friends, no history, no roots anywhere. "My mother," Margaret said slowly, "loved me. Whatever else might or might not be true, that woman loved me more than anything in this world." "I believe you," William said. "I do. But Margaret, if she took you, if she kept you, there had to be a reason. Desperation, maybe. Mental illness. Some circumstance that made her do something unforgivable out of something that might have started as love, or loneliness, or—" He stopped, seeing the defensive anger flaring in Margaret's eyes. "I'm sorry. I'm not trying to judge. I'm just trying to understand. Trying to piece together 26 years of absence." The bell over the diner's entrance chimed, and Margaret looked up to see Danny approaching their table. His young face creased with concern. Danny was 19, working his way through community college. A sweet kid who'd only been at the Golden Lotus for 6 months, but who'd already become something like a friend in the way coworkers do when you spend 40 hours a week together in close quarters. "Maggie, you okay?" Danny asked, using the nickname she'd acquired here, the casual abbreviation that made her feel like someone else, someone lighter than Margaret, someone without the weight of student loans and medical bills and the constant grinding anxiety of barely making rent. "Rick's asking why table 17 hasn't turned yet." "I'm fine," Margaret said automatically, though she was anything but. "I just give me 5 minutes." Danny glanced at William, taking in the expensive suit, the tears on the old man's face, the strange tableau they made. "Is this guy bothering you? Because I can get Rick, or I can." "No," Margaret said quickly. "No, it's okay. Really. Just 5 minutes." Danny hesitated, then nodded and retreated, though Margaret could feel him watching from across the diner, ready to intervene if needed. It was a small kindness, that readiness to protect, and it reminded Margaret of all the small kindnesses she'd encountered in her life. The teacher who'd helped her apply for scholarships, the doctor who'd reduced her mother's cancer treatment bills, the landlord who'd given her an extra week on rent when she'd been laid off from her previous job at the mall. Kindness, she'd learned, was the currency that mattered when you had nothing else. "I don't know what to do with this," Margaret admitted, turning back to William. "I don't know how to process what you're telling me." "Let me help you," William said. "Please, let me arrange a DNA test. There are labs that can do it quickly, privately. If I'm wrong, if this is just an impossible coincidence, then I'll apologize for disrupting your life and we'll part ways. But Margaret, if I'm right..." His voice caught again. "If I'm right, then you have a family. Uncles, aunts, cousins. People who've missed you, who've wondered about you. A grandfather who would give anything, anything at all, to have the chance to know you. Margaret looked down at her hands, at the crescent moon scar that had always been just a quirk of her body, a small imperfection she'd never questioned. She thought about the birth certificate her mother had shown her once, the one that listed Rebecca Chen as her mother and left the father's name blank. She thought about how that had felt normal, unremarkable, because plenty of kids were raised by single mothers, plenty of people didn't know their fathers. But this was different. This wasn't a missing father. This was a missing entire life. What was her name? Margaret asked quietly. Your daughter. You said Sarah. But tell me about her. William's face softened, memory smoothing some of the anguish into something gentler. Sarah Catherine Hartley. She was born on a Tuesday in March 3 months before she was taken. She was perfect, Margaret. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a head full of dark hair. She had colic, kept us up all night, but we didn't care. My wife Catherine, she'd wanted a baby for so long. We'd tried for years, had almost given up hope. And then Sarah came, and it felt like our whole world had finally clicked into place. He pulled out his wallet with shaking hands, fumbled through it until he found a photograph worn soft at the edges from years of handling. He placed it on the table between them, and Margaret found herself looking at a baby in a pink blanket, dark eyes wide and curious, tiny fingers curled against chubby cheeks. This was taken 2 days before she disappeared, William said. It's the last photograph we have. Margaret stared at the image, trying to see herself in that infant face, trying to bridge the impossible gap between that baby and the woman she'd become. Was there resemblance? Did that nose match her own? Were those eyes the same eyes that looked back at her from mirrors? She couldn't tell. She didn't know. The uncertainty was suffocating. The police, Margaret said. If there was a kidnapping, there must have been an investigation. Files, evidence, suspects. Thousands of leads, William confirmed. None of them went anywhere. It was as if Sarah had simply vanished into thin air. For years, we hired private investigators. We followed every possible trail. There were sightings all over the country, but none of them were her. We spent millions. We appeared on television shows, news programs, anywhere that might help. And then slowly, as the years passed, the trail went cold. The investigators had nothing new to report. The police moved on to other cases. Everyone told us we had to accept that she was gone. But you didn't, Margaret said. Never, William said fiercely. Catherine and I made a promise to each other the day Sarah was born. We would never stop fighting for her, never stop looking, never stop hoping. Even after Catherine passed, she made me promise I'd keep searching. So I have private investigators, age progression software, DNA databases. I've had my DNA on file with every registry that exists, hoping for a match, for anything. Margaret felt dizzy, overwhelmed. She glanced at the clock on the wall, 3:15 p.m. She still had 3 hours left on her shift. She had tables to serve, orders to take, tips to earn, because tips were how she paid for groceries and utilities and the community college courses she was taking online, trying to piece together a degree in business administration one class at a time. But how could she just stand up and walk away from this? How could she go back to pouring coffee and taking orders when William Hartley sat across from her claiming she was the answer to 26 years of searching? I need time, Margaret said. I need to think about this, process this. I can't make a decision right now. Of course, William said quickly. Of course I understand. But please take my card. My private number is on there. Call me anytime, day or night. And Margaret. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, along with something else, a small velvet pouch. This belonged to Sarah. Catherine wanted her to have it when she was old enough. I've carried it with me every day since she was taken. I want you to have it now, whether you take the DNA test or not. Margaret opened the pouch with trembling fingers. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet, sized for an infant, with a small charm in the shape of a crescent moon. The irony wasn't lost on her. A moon charm and a moon-shaped scar. Coincidence, her rational mind insisted. Just coincidence. But another part of her, A deeper part that lived beneath logic and reason whispered, "What if?" Margaret's apartment was a studio on the third floor of a building that had been scheduled for renovation 3 years ago, before the owner died and left the property in legal limbo. The elevator had been broken for 6 months. The water heater worked approximately 60% of the time. The radiator clanged and hissed through winter nights like a mechanical ghost trying to communicate in Morse code. But the rent was $675 a month, utilities included, which meant Margaret could almost afford it if she worked 50 hours a week and ate a lot of rice and beans. She climbed the stairs slowly that evening, her feet aching, her mind spinning in circles that went nowhere and everywhere at once. The bracelet was a small weight in her purse, along with William Hartley's business card. She'd finished her shift in a daze, going through the motions of service with mechanical precision, while her thoughts raced through possibilities and implications like mice in a maze with no exit. Danny had cornered her during her break, concern written across his young face. What was that about? That old guy? Did he proposition you or something? Because if he did, Rick should ban him. That's not okay. No, Margaret had said, appreciating his protective instinct even as she struggled to explain. Nothing like that. He thought I was someone else. Someone he'd been looking for. Was he confused? Like dementia or something? Maybe, Margaret had said, though she didn't believe it. William Hartley's eyes had been many things. Grief-stricken, desperate, hopeful, but not confused. He'd known exactly what he was saying, what he was claiming. Now, alone in her apartment with its kitchenette and Murphy bed and single window that overlooked an alley, Margaret finally allowed herself to fully consider the impossible thing that had happened at table 17. She dropped her purse on the small table that served as both dining surface and desk, kicked off her shoes, and sank onto the narrow bed. Her body screamed for rest, but her mind wouldn't quiet. Instead, she pulled out her phone and did what people in the 21st century do when confronted with the unbelievable. She started searching. William Hartley brought up hundreds of results. There he was on the Hartley Industries website, listed as chairman of the board, a position he'd apparently stepped back from after his wife's death, though he remained the company's largest shareholder. Forbes estimated his net worth at $3.2 billion. $3.2 billion. Margaret couldn't even conceptualize that much money. It was a number from a different universe, a reality so distant from her own it might as well have been fiction. She found photographs of him at charity galas, cutting ribbons at hospital wings, accepting humanitarian awards. In every image, he looked distinguished, powerful, composed. Not at all like the broken man who'd wept at table 17. She searched for Sarah Hartley kidnapping and found herself falling into a rabbit hole of news articles, true crime forums, and outdated missing persons databases. The story was sensational enough to have captured national attention in 1999. Wealthy couple's infant daughter stolen from her crib in the family's mansion in Hillcrest, the upscale neighborhood where homes cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. The articles painted a picture of devoted parents destroyed by loss. Catherine Hartley, elegant and refined in photographs, her eyes haunted even in professional portraits. William Hartley, offering increasingly larger rewards, appearing on morning shows and evening news programs, begging whoever had taken Sarah to return her. There were suspects or people who'd been investigated. A housekeeper who'd been fired 2 weeks before the kidnapping, cleared after she'd been in another state at the time. A gardener with a criminal record also cleared. Theories about organized adoption rings, about ransom demands that never materialized, about tragedy and accident and cover-up. But no answers, no resolution, just a baby who'd vanished and parents who'd been left with nothing but grief and questions. Margaret found herself staring at an age progression image created 10 years after the kidnapping. What Sarah Hartley might look like at age 13. The digital reconstruction showed a girl with dark hair, dark eyes, a serious expression. Did she look like that girl? Margaret pulled up the photo app on her phone, found a picture of herself from her high school graduation, held it next to the age progression image. Maybe, maybe not. It was impossible to tell. She set the phone aside and pulled out the velvet pouch again, examining the bracelet in the overhead light. It was real gold, she could tell from the weight, the luster. The crescent moon charm was delicate, expertly crafted. On the back of the charm, she noticed something she'd missed before. An engraving. Tiny letters that required squinting to read. SCH. Sarah Catherine Hartley. Margaret's hands began to shake. She set the bracelet down on the table, stared at it as if it might transform into something else. Something less loaded with impossible implications. Her phone buzzed with a text from Danny. "You good? You seemed weird today." She typed back, "Just tired. Long shift." The lie came easily, but it sat heavy in her chest. Because she wasn't good. She was standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying. A chasm that opened between the life she'd known and a life she might have had, might still have, might be entitled to. Margaret thought about her mother, the only mother she'd ever known. Rebecca Chen, who'd worked as a home health aide, visiting elderly clients and helping them with daily tasks. Who'd sung to Margaret in Mandarin even though Margaret never learned to speak the language. Who'd made dumplings on special occasions, folding the dough with practiced precision while telling Margaret stories about perseverance and hard work and making your own way in a world that didn't care if you sank or swam. Rebecca, who'd had cancer that started in her breast and spread to her lungs, her bones, her brain. Who'd fought it for 3 years with the stubbornness of someone who knew her daughter needed her. Who'd finally lost that fight on a Wednesday afternoon with Margaret holding her hand, whispering that it was okay to let go, that she'd be okay, even though neither of them believed it. Margaret had been 22. She'd dropped out of college to care for her mother, to work enough jobs to cover what insurance wouldn't. She'd learned to change 4 bags, to manage pain medication, to hold her grief in check because her mother needed her to be strong. Rebecca's last words had been, "I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." Margaret had assumed she was apologizing for dying, for leaving Margaret alone. But what if it had been something else? What if those words had carried the weight of a secret kept for 26 years? No. Margaret shook her head, rejecting the thought. Her mother had loved her. That love had been real, tangible, the foundation of Margaret's entire existence. Whatever else might be true, that couldn't be questioned. But love and kidnapping weren't mutually exclusive. A small voice in her head whispered. People did terrible things out of love all the time. Desperate people. Broken people. People who wanted something so badly they convinced themselves they had the right to take it. Margaret stood abruptly, pacing the small space of her apartment. She needed more information. She needed to understand who Rebecca Chen had been before Margaret was born. She'd always accepted her mother's vague explanations about her past, about growing up in foster care in California, about having no family, no one to call when things got hard. But now those explanations felt thin, full of holes large enough to drive a truck through. She pulled out a cardboard box from under her bed, the one containing everything she had left of her mother. It wasn't much. A few photographs, some costume jewelry, a worn Bible, the death certificate, Rebecca's driver's license. Margaret spread the items on her bed, examining them with new eyes. The driver's license showed Rebecca Chen, born June 15, 1971, in Sacramento, California. But Margaret had been born in Nebraska, Lincoln, according to her birth certificate. Why Nebraska? Why so far from where Rebecca had supposedly grown up? She found a photograph of Rebecca holding infant Margaret, both of them bundled against cold weather. Margaret's baby face was barely visible beneath a knit cap. Rebecca looked young. She would have been 28 when Margaret was born. But there was something in her expression that seemed older, wearier, as if she'd already lived several lifetimes. Where had this photo been taken? Margaret flipped it over, but the back was blank. She examined other photographs, looking for clues, for context. Most were from Margaret's childhood, birthday parties, first day of school pictures, a trip to a zoo Margaret couldn't remember. But there were no photographs of Rebecca pregnant, no baby shower pictures, no hospital photos from Margaret's birth. For the first time in her life, Margaret found these absences strange, suspicious. Her phone rang, startling her so badly she jumped. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer, telemarketers probably, or spam callers trying to steal her identity or sell her a timeshare. But something made her press the accept button. "Hello, Margaret? It's William Hartley." I hope I'm not calling too late. His voice was uncertain, almost timid. Nothing like the commanding tone he'd probably used to build a billion-dollar empire. Margaret glanced at the clock. 9:37 p.m. No, it's fine. I'm still awake. I couldn't stop thinking about you, William said. About today. I'm sorry if I frightened you, if I pushed too hard. My wife Catherine always said I had no sense of boundaries when I wanted something. I had to call. I had to make sure you were all right. I'm not sure what I am, Margaret admitted. She sat back down on the bed, surrounded by the scattered pieces of her mother's life. I've been looking through my mother's things, looking for, I don't even know what, answers, I guess. Did you find any? Just more questions. Margaret paused, then made a decision. Tell me about the day she was taken. Sarah, tell me exactly what happened. William was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret could hear him breathing, could sense the weight of memory pressing down through the phone connection. It was June 7th, he finally said. 3 months after Sarah was born. Catherine and I had been to a fundraiser that evening, one of those charity things we were always expected to attend. We had a nanny, Mrs. Delacroix, watching Sarah. We came home around 11. Mrs. Delacroix said Sarah had been fussy but had finally fallen asleep around 10. Catherine and I checked on her. She was sleeping peacefully in her crib. We went to bed. He paused, and Margaret heard him take a shaky breath. I woke up around 3 in the morning. I don't know why, just a feeling, maybe. I went to check on Sarah. The nursery door was open. It should have been closed. And when I looked in the crib, his voice broke. She was gone. Just gone. The window was open, the screen removed. There were no footprints in the garden below, no fingerprints on the window. Whoever took her knew what they were doing. They'd planned it. Did you hear anything? See anything? Nothing. Catherine and I both slept through it. We've asked ourselves 1,000 times how that's possible. But we were exhausted. Catherine especially. She'd been up with Sarah almost every night. We'd finally thought we could get a full night's sleep. And someone used that opportunity to steal our daughter. Margaret felt a chill run through her. What about the nanny? Mrs. Delacroix? She was cleared completely. She'd gone home to her own apartment miles away. Multiple witnesses placed her there. She was devastated by what happened, blamed herself for years, even though she'd done nothing wrong. William's voice hardened. The police investigated everyone. Friends, employees, business associates. They found nothing. It was as if Sarah had been taken by a ghost. But not a ghost, Margaret said quietly. Someone real. Someone who, if I'm really Sarah, someone who raised me as their own daughter. Yes, William said. Someone who either took you themselves or bought you from someone who did. The investigators always theorized it might have been an illegal adoption. Someone desperate for a baby, willing to pay, willing to not ask questions about where the baby came from. Margaret thought about her mother, about Rebecca Chen, who'd had no family, no history, who'd moved frequently during Margaret's childhood, who'd always been vigilant, always careful, always looking over her shoulder. If Rebecca Chen was involved, she never had any money, Margaret said. We were always struggling. She worked multiple jobs just to keep us fed and housed. If she'd paid someone for a baby, where did that money come from? And why would someone desperate enough to buy a child be willing to live in poverty? I don't know, William admitted. That's one of the things that doesn't fit the pattern. Most illegal adoptions involve wealthy couples who can't conceive or can't adopt through legal channels. They pay facilitators, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars. Your mother, if she was involved, doesn't fit that profile. Maybe she wasn't involved, Margaret said, grasping for an explanation that didn't paint Rebecca as a criminal. Maybe someone gave me to her, told her I was abandoned, or that my biological parents didn't want me. Maybe she thought she was rescuing me. Maybe, William said, but Margaret could hear the doubt in his voice. Margaret, I don't want to speak ill of the woman who raised you. I can hear in your voice how much you loved her, how much she meant to you. But we need to know the truth. And the only way to know for certain is through DNA testing. Margaret looked down at the crescent moon bracelet on her table, at the engraved initials that might or might not be meant for her. "If I take the test," she said slowly, "and it comes back positive, if I really am Sarah Hartley, what then? My life is here. My job, my apartment, my plans. I'm taking online classes, trying to finish my degree. I can't just step into some other life like the past 26 years didn't happen." "I would never ask you to," William said firmly. "You're an adult, Margaret. Your own person. If you're Sarah, if you're my granddaughter, that doesn't erase who you've become. It just means you have more. More family, more resources, more options. But the choice of what to do with those things would be entirely yours." "More resources," Margaret repeated, thinking about the Forbes article. The billions of dollars. The life of wealth and privilege that might have been hers if someone hadn't opened a nursery window on a June night. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Money. Inheritance. "No," William said, and the force of the word startled her. "God, no. Margaret, I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. I've already arranged for the bulk of my estate to go to charitable foundations and research hospitals. If you're Sarah, if you're my granddaughter, I would want to provide for you, yes. I'd want to make sure you never had to struggle again. But that's not why I searched for you. That's not why I've spent 26 years hoping. I searched because you're my blood. Because you're all that's left of my daughter and my wife. Because somewhere in this world was a little girl who belonged with us, who should have been raised in her own home, who had a right to know where she came from." Margaret felt tears prickling at her eyes. She didn't know if she believed him, didn't know if anyone could truly separate love from money when that much wealth was involved. But she wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that somewhere in the world was a family that had never stopped looking for her. "I'll take the test," she heard herself say. "But I need you to understand something. Rebecca Chen was my mother. She's the one who raised me, who loved me, who died making sure I had what I needed. Whatever the DNA says, whatever the truth turns out to be, that doesn't change." "Of course," William said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "Of course. She raised you, Margaret. She shaped who you are. Nothing can take that away." They arranged to meet at a private medical facility the next day. William offered to send a car for her, but Margaret declined. She'd take the bus the same way she got everywhere. She wasn't ready to accept anything from him, not until she knew for certain. After they hung up, Margaret sat in the silence of her apartment for a long time, trying to reconcile the two versions of her life that couldn't both be true but somehow both were. She was Margaret Chen, daughter of Rebecca Chen, waitress at the Golden Lotus Diner, student at Lincoln Community College. A woman who knew exactly who she was and where she came from. Except maybe she wasn't. Maybe she was Sarah Catherine Hartley, stolen from wealth and privilege, raised in poverty by a woman who had no right to call herself a mother, living a life that had never been meant for her. Or maybe, and this was the possibility that terrified her most, she was both, and neither, a person caught between two truths, belonging fully to neither. Margaret barely slept that night. When her alarm went off at 5:30 a.m., she felt hollowed out, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. She had a morning shift at the diner, 6 to 2, and she couldn't afford to call in sick. Rick had already warned her that he needed reliable employees, and in the service industry, reliable meant never having problems, never having emergencies, never being human. She moved through her morning routine mechanically. Shower in water that ran lukewarm at best. Instant coffee that tasted like burnt cardboard. The same black pants and white shirt she wore every shift. Washed in the building's basement laundry room and dried on a rack in her apartment because the dryers ate quarters without actually drying anything. The bus was crowded with early morning commuters. People heading to construction sites and warehouse jobs and retail positions that started before the sun came up. Margaret found a seat near the back and stared out the window at the city waking up. Lincoln, Nebraska. The only home she'd ever known, or at least the only one she remembered. They'd lived in other places when she was young. She had vague memories of a different apartment, a different city, though she couldn't place where or when. Her mother had moved them around frequently during Margaret's early childhood, never staying anywhere longer than a year or two. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Why? Margaret had never questioned it before, had accepted her mother's explanations about following job opportunities, about not being able to afford lease renewals, about wanting a fresh start. But now she wondered, had Rebecca been running, hiding, constantly looking over her shoulder, afraid someone would recognize Margaret, would remember a news story about a stolen baby with distinctive dark eyes and a crescent moon scar? The Golden Lotus Diner was already buzzing when Margaret arrived. The morning rush had started, workers grabbing breakfast sandwiches and coffee before heading to their jobs, elderly regulars claiming their usual booths, a few college students recovering from late-night study sessions or parties. Danny was already there, looking more alert than anyone had a right to be at 6 a.m. He waved when he saw Margaret. "Hey Maggie, you feeling better? You looked pretty wiped out yesterday." "Still tired," Margaret said, tying her apron around her waist. "But I'll survive." "That old guy who was freaking you out, he didn't come back, did he?" Margaret thought about the phone call, the DNA test scheduled for this afternoon. "No, he didn't come back." The morning passed in a blur of orders and refills and the endless dance of restaurant service. Margaret had learned to exist in a state of divided consciousness during busy shifts. Part of her mind focused on tables and orders and customer needs, another part floating somewhere else entirely, thinking about bills or classes or whatever problem currently dominated her life. Today that other part of her mind couldn't stop circling back to William Hartley's face as he grabbed her hand. The desperate certainty in his voice when he'd said, "You have my daughter's eyes." She was taking an order from table 9, an elderly couple who came in every Thursday for the breakfast special, when she became aware of someone watching her. She looked up and saw a woman standing near the entrance, staring at Margaret with an intensity that made her skin prickle. The woman was maybe 60, stylishly dressed in clothes that spoke of money and taste. Her hair was perfectly cut and colored, a rich auburn that might or might not have been natural. She wore minimal makeup but had the kind of skin that came from expensive treatments and careful maintenance. Her eyes, pale blue, like William Hartley's, were locked on Margaret's face. Margaret finished taking the order and approached the woman. "Just one for breakfast? Are you Margaret Chen?" the woman asked, her voice cultured, with the faint accent of someone who'd been educated in private schools. Margaret felt her stomach drop. "Yes. Do I know you?" "No. But I know who you are." The woman's expression was difficult to read. Not hostile exactly, but not friendly either. "My name is Victoria Hartley Morrison. I'm William Hartley's daughter. Which would make me, if you're who he thinks you are, your aunt." The diner seemed to tilt around Margaret. She gripped the edge of the nearest table to steady herself. We haven't even done the DNA test yet." "How did you?" "My father called me last night," Victoria said. He was beside himself, crying, laughing, barely coherent. He said he'd found Sarah, that she was here, working in this diner, that she had my sister's eyes. Victoria's own eyes narrowed slightly. "So I came to see for myself." Margaret became aware that other customers were watching, that Danny had stopped mid-pour at the coffee station, that Rick had emerged from the back office looking annoyed at the disruption. Is there somewhere we can talk? Privately?" Victoria glanced around the diner with an expression that suggested she found it vaguely distasteful. "Is there?" Margaret led her outside, into the parking lot where the morning sun was already burning off the cool of dawn. Her hands were shaking. This was too much, too fast. She wasn't ready for family members, for people who had expectations and claims and histories that might or might not involve her. "I need you to understand something," Victoria said once they were alone. "My sister Sarah's disappearance destroyed my family. I was 5 years old when she was taken. I watched my mother fall apart, watched her become someone else, someone consumed by grief and guilt and obsession. I watched my father pour millions into dead-end investigations. I grew up in a house haunted by a ghost, by a sister I barely remembered, but who was somehow always present." "I'm sorry," Margaret said, because what else could she say? "That must have been terrible." "It was," Victoria agreed. And when Sarah was never found, when years turned into decades, I finally accepted that she was gone. Dead, probably. I grieved, I moved on, I built a life. I got married, had children of my own. I made peace with the fact that my little sister was never coming back. Margaret could sense where this was going. And now your father thinks he's found her. Found me. And you're here to tell me I'm wrong. That I'm some kind of con artist or delusional. No, Victoria interrupted. That's not why I'm here. She stepped closer, studying Margaret's face with an intensity that was almost scientific. I'm here because when I looked at the photograph my father sent me last night, a picture he took of you on his phone, I saw something that made me drive 4 hours from Omaha at 5 in the morning. What did you see? My sister, Victoria said simply. Not the baby I remember. I barely remember her at all. But the girl from the age progression images. The woman Sarah might have become. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, swiped through photos until she found what she wanted. This is my daughter Emma. She's 23. Margaret looked at the photo and felt the world shift again. The young woman in the picture had dark hair, dark eyes, a serious expression. The resemblance wasn't identical, but it was there. Something in the bone structure, the shape of the face, the intensity of the gaze. Family resemblance, Victoria said. Emma looks like my side of the family, like my grandmother did, like I did at her age. And you? She stopped, swallowed hard. You look like you could be Emma's sister, which would make sense if you're Sarah. If you're my niece. Margaret handed the phone back, feeling overwhelmed. I don't know what I'm supposed to say. I don't know what you want from me. I want you to be careful, Victoria said. And now there was steel in her voice. My father is a good man, but he's also desperate. He's been searching for Sarah for 26 years. He's funded every crazy lead, chased every impossible hope. He wants so badly for you to be her that he might convince himself you are even if you're not. Which is why we're doing a DNA test, Margaret said. This afternoon, at a private lab. Victoria nodded approvingly. Good. That's smart. But Margaret, if the test comes back positive, if you really are Sarah, you need to understand what you're stepping into. The Hartley family isn't just my father. There's my brother James, there's my husband's family. There are cousins and business associates and a whole world of people who will have opinions about you, expectations of you. People who will want things from you. Money, Margaret said flatly. You're worried I'll take money from your father. Reduce your inheritance. Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. I don't care about the money. I'm a patent attorney, Margaret. My husband is a surgeon. We're more than comfortable. What I care about is my father's well-being. He's 78 years old. He has a heart condition. The stress of this, the hope, the possibility of losing you again if it turns out you're not Sarah. It could kill him. Margaret felt a flash of anger. So I should what? Walk away? Pretend this never happened? Your father is the one who grabbed my hand in the middle of my shift and told me I had his daughter's eyes. I didn't ask for this. I didn't go looking for the Hartley family. He found me. I know, Victoria said, and her expression softened slightly. I know. And if you were Sarah, if you're my sister, then I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what was taken from you. I'm sorry you grew up without us, without the life you should have had. But Margaret, you need to understand that being Sarah Hartley comes with complications you can't imagine. The media attention alone, when this gets out, and it will get out, there's no keeping something like this quiet, you'll be swarmed. Every news outlet, every tabloid, every true crime podcast will want your story. Your life will never be private again. Margaret thought about her small apartment, her shifts at the diner, her online classes. A quiet life, a simple life, but one that was hers. Maybe the test will come back negative, she said. Maybe this is all just a terrible coincidence and I can go back to being nobody. Maybe, Victoria said, but she didn't sound convinced. She pulled out a business card. This is my number. If you need anything, advice, support, someone who understands the Hartley family dynamics, call me. Regardless of what the DNA test says. Margaret took the card, adding it to the collection of Hartley family contact information she was apparently accumulating. Victoria Hartley Morrison, attorney at law, with an Omaha address and multiple phone numbers. I should get back inside, Margaret said. My manager is probably freaking out. Of course. Victoria hesitated, then did something unexpected. She reached out and gently touched Margaret's cheek, a gesture so tender and so sad it made Margaret's eyes sting with unshed tears. You do have Sarah's eyes, she said softly. The same eyes our mother had. I'd forgotten, but seeing you, it came back. The way the light catches in them makes them look almost black. She dropped her hand. Be careful, Margaret. With my father, with all of this. Promise me. I promise, Margaret said, though she had no idea if it was a promise she could keep. Back inside the diner, Rick was waiting with crossed arms and a scowl. You want to tell me why you're taking personal meetings during your shift? I'm sorry, Margaret said automatically. It was family emergency. It won't happen again. It better not, Rick said. We're short-staffed as it is. I can't have servers just wandering off whenever they feel like it. Margaret nodded, swallowing her frustration. She wanted to tell Rick that she might be the heiress to a billion-dollar fortune, that she might be the answer to a decades-old mystery, that her life was potentially about to change in ways that would make waitressing at the Golden Lotus Diner utterly irrelevant. But she didn't, because it might all be nothing. It might all be a mistake. And even if it wasn't, she still needed this job until she knew for certain. The rest of her shift was torture. Every time the door opened, she half expected another Hartley family member to walk in. Every time someone looked at her for more than a few seconds, she wondered if they somehow knew, if word was already spreading about the waitress who might be a missing heiress. Danny finally cornered her in the kitchen during the lunch rush. Okay, what is going on? First that old guy yesterday, now some fancy lady shows up asking for you by name. Are you in trouble? Do you need help? Margaret looked at his earnest young face, at the concern in his eyes, and felt a wave of affection for this kid who barely knew her but was ready to defend her anyway. I'm not in trouble, she said. I promise. It's just complicated family stuff. Nothing dangerous. You sure? Because if you need anything, like if you need a place to crash or whatever, my mom's got a spare room. She's always saying I should bring friends around more. Thank you, Margaret said, and meant it. Really. But I'm okay. She left the diner at 2:15, exhausted and anxious. The medical facility where William had arranged for the DNA test was across town, a discreet building in a professional complex. Margaret took 2 buses to get there, arriving 15 minutes early. William was already in the waiting room, looking older somehow than he had the day before, as if the hope and stress had aged him overnight. He stood when she entered, his face flooding with relief. Margaret, thank you for coming. Thank you for doing this. I'm here for the truth, Margaret said. Whatever that turns out to be. They were taken to a private room where a technician explained the procedure, a simple cheek swab, completely non-invasive. The samples would be sent to a lab that specialized in paternity and kinship testing. Results would be available in 3 to 5 business days, but William had paid for expedited processing. They'd know within 48 hours. The swabbing took less than 5 minutes. Margaret opened her mouth, felt the soft scrape of cotton against the inside of her cheek, and thought about how such a small thing could hold such enormous answers. That's it? She asked when the technician sealed the samples. That's it, William confirmed. Now we wait. They stood in the parking lot afterward, the afternoon sun beating down, the moment awkward, and waited with everything unsaid. Can I take you to dinner? William asked. There's so much I want to know about you, about your life, your childhood. Whether the DNA confirms you're Sarah or not, I'd like to know the person you are. Margaret was about to decline. She was exhausted, overwhelmed, needed space to process. When her phone buzzed with a text from her landlord. Rent due tomorrow. No more extensions. She'd forgotten, completely forgotten in the chaos of the past day, that her rent was due, and she was $200 short. She'd been planning to pick up extra shifts this week, but she'd been so distracted by William Hartley and his impossible claims that it had slipped her mind. Actually, she heard herself say, dinner would be nice. William took her to a restaurant Margaret would never have entered on her own. The kind of place where there were no prices on the menu, where the waitstaff moved with silent efficiency, where every detail spoke of money so old and established it didn't need to announce itself. The Meridian occupied the top floor of the Skyline Tower, offering panoramic views of Lincoln that made the city look elegant and planned, rather than the patchwork of struggling neighborhoods and gentrified downtown blocks Margaret knew it to be. She felt acutely aware of her cheap work clothes, her scuffed shoes, the faint smell of fryer oil that probably clung to her hair despite her shower that morning. But if the host noticed or cared, he didn't show it, leading them to a private corner table with the deference usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. "I know this is overwhelming," William said once they were seated. Once Margaret had stared at the wine list with its 3-digit prices and politely declined, asking for water instead. "We don't have to talk about Sarah, about the test, about any of it. Tell me about yourself. What you like, what you dream about, what makes you laugh." It was a kind gesture, an attempt to treat her as a person rather than a mystery to be solved. But Margaret found she couldn't separate herself from the questions hanging between them. Who was she? Where did she come from? Every detail of her life now felt suspect, potentially a lie or a cover story. "I don't know what's real anymore," she admitted. "I thought I knew exactly who I was." Margaret Chen, daughter of Rebecca Chen, born in Lincoln, Nebraska, graduated from Lincoln High, worked at the mall, then the diner, taking online classes to finish a business degree. "I had a whole narrative about my life, and now," she gestured helplessly, "now I don't know if any of it's true." "Your experiences are true," William said gently. "Whatever the DNA says, you lived your life. Those memories, those relationships, those struggles, they're real. But the foundation everything was built on might be a lie," Margaret countered. "Who my mother was, why we moved around so much, why she had no family, no history. It's like finding out the ground you've been standing on was actually thin ice all along." A waiter appeared with water and bread, asked if they'd like to hear the specials. William ordered for both of them without asking what Margaret wanted. Normally something that would have annoyed her, but she was grateful not to have to decode a menu that included terms like deconstructed and artisanal and locally sourced. "Tell me about Rebecca," William said once the waiter had left. "The woman who raised you. What was she like?" Margaret thought about how to distill 22 years of life into a description that would make sense to a stranger. "She was strong," she finally said. "Incredibly strong. She worked multiple jobs for as long as I can remember, home health care mostly, taking care of elderly people. She'd leave early in the morning, come home late at night, sometimes not sleep at all if she had a client who needed round-the-clock care." "That must have been hard for you," William observed. "Being alone so much." "I got used to it. I was a latchkey kid from about age 8. I'd let myself into our apartment after school, do my homework, make dinner from whatever was in the fridge. Lots of rice, lots of canned vegetables. She'd come home exhausted and I'd have food waiting." Margaret smiled at the memory. She used to say I was her little angel, that she didn't know what she'd do without me. "She must have loved you very much." "She did," Margaret said fiercely. "Whatever else might be true, I know that absolutely. She loved me more than anything in the world." The first course arrived. Some kind of soup that was more art than food, garnished with microgreens and a drizzle of something amber-colored. Margaret ate it carefully, aware of William watching her, studying her the way you might study a painting you thought might be a masterpiece or might be a forgery. "You said you moved around a lot when you were young," William prompted. "Do you remember where?" "Vaguely. Denver for a while, I think. Maybe Kansas City? It's all kind of blurred together. She'd get a job, we'd move, then the job would end or something would happen and we'd move again. We settled in Lincoln when I was about 8 and we stayed. She'd found steady work with a home care agency, and I think she was tired of uprooting us. Or tired of running, Margaret thought but didn't say. "Did she ever talk about your father?" Margaret shook her head. "Only to say he wasn't in the picture. I used to ask when I was little, all kids want to know where they came from, who their parents are. She'd get this look, kind of sad and kind of angry at the same time, and say he'd left before I was born. That he wasn't someone I needed to worry about. And you accepted that? Eventually. When you're a kid, you accept what you're told because you don't have any other frame of reference. It wasn't until I was older that I started thinking about how strange it was that I had no extended family at all. No grandparents, no aunts or uncles, no cousins. Just me and her against the world. The main course came, some kind of fish Margaret didn't recognize, perfectly cooked and plated with vegetables she'd never seen at the grocery store. She ate mechanically, her appetite suppressed by anxiety and the surreality of the situation. After she died, William said carefully, did you go through her papers? Look for information about her past. There wasn't much to go through, Margaret admitted. She didn't have a lot of possessions. Some clothes, some jewelry, a few books. No safe deposit box, no secret files. I found her birth certificate, her driver's license, some employment records. Nothing that told me anything I didn't already know. What about photos? Old friends? Anyone who might have known her before you were born? No friends that I knew of. She was private, kept to herself. The only people she really interacted with were her clients and their families. Margaret set down her fork, suddenly unable to eat another bite. You're trying to figure out if she was capable of kidnapping, aren't you? If the woman who raised me was the kind of person who could steal someone else's child. William looked pained. I'm trying to understand. That's all. If you were Sarah, if someone took you from us, I need to know how it happened. Why it happened. Not for revenge or punishment, your mother is gone, beyond reach of any justice, but for understanding. For closure. What if I don't want closure? Margaret asked. What if I'd rather just not know? Is that really true? Margaret thought about it, really thought about it. Could she go back to her life at the diner, to her studio apartment, to her online classes, knowing that somewhere out there was a family who might be hers? Could she ignore the crescent moon scar, the distinctive eyes, the impossible coincidence of birth dates? Could she live with questions that might have answers? No, she admitted quietly. No, I can't unknow what I've learned. I can't go back to the person I was before you grabbed my hand at table 17. I'm sorry, William said, and he looked it. I've disrupted your entire life. If I'd been thinking clearly, if I'd been more careful, you would have done exactly the same thing, Margaret interrupted. If you really believed I was your granddaughter, you had to say something. You had to try. She took a sip of water, gathering her courage for the question that had been eating at her since Victoria's visit that morning. Your daughter, Victoria. She came to see me today, at the diner. William's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something like resignation. She did? What did she say? She warned me. About you, about the family, about what it would mean if I really am Sarah. She seemed... Margaret searched for the right word. Protective. Of you, mostly. She's worried the stress of this will hurt you. Victoria has always been protective, William said with a slight smile. Even as a child, she took her role as big sister very seriously. After Sarah was taken, she became even more vigilant. She'd check on her mother and me constantly, as if afraid we might disappear too. She showed me a picture of her daughter, Margaret said. Emma. She said we look alike. You do, William confirmed. Not identical, but there's a family resemblance. The Hartley bone structure, my wife used to call it. Catherine would have loved meeting you, Sarah or not. She always wanted more grandchildren. The waiter returned with dessert. Some elaborate construction involving chocolate and gold leaf that seemed designed more for Instagram than actual eating. Margaret pushed it around her plate, her mind elsewhere. What if the test comes back negative? She asked suddenly. What if we're both wrong, and I'm just a waitress who happens to look like your missing granddaughter? William considered this. Then I'll apologize for disrupting your life, and I'll go back to searching. I've done it for 26 years. I can do it for 26 more if I have to. But you don't believe that will happen. You think I'm her. I know you're her, William said with absolute certainty. I knew it the moment I saw your eyes. I'd know Sarah anywhere, at any age. She's my granddaughter. You're my granddaughter. Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. Some wall she'd built around her heart to protect it from hope. Because what if he was right? What if she really was Sarah Catherine Hartley, stolen as a baby, raised under a false name, deprived of a family that had never stopped searching for her? What if Rebecca Chen, the woman she'd loved more than anyone, the woman who'd sacrificed everything to raise her, had been a kidnapper? The thought was unbearable. But it was also, Margaret was beginning to realize, probably true. After dinner, William insisted on driving her home. His car was what Margaret expected. A sleek black Mercedes with leather seats and a sound system that probably cost more than her entire apartment. She gave him her address reluctantly, aware of how shabby the building would look to someone who lived in a mansion in Hillcrest. But William didn't comment on the broken elevator or the graffiti in the lobby or the flickering fluorescent lights in the hallway. He walked her to her door like a gentleman, his hands in his pockets, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you for dinner," Margaret said, fishing for her keys. "And for everything. For being patient with me while I try to process all this." "You've been remarkably composed," William said. "More than I would be in your situation. Catherine would have liked you," he added, his voice growing soft. "She would have seen your strength, your resilience. She always said the world needed more strong women." "Tell me about her," Margaret asked impulsively. "Your wife. What was she like?" William's face transformed, grief and love mixing into an expression so profound it hurt to witness. Catherine she was everything. Brilliant, compassionate, fierce when she needed to be. We met in college. She was pre-med, I was in business. Everyone said we were too different, that it wouldn't last. We lasted 48 years. He smiled sadly. She wanted to be a doctor, but she got pregnant with Victoria and decided to put medical school on hold. Then James came along and then Sarah. She never did go back to medicine, but she poured all that intelligence and energy into charitable work. She founded 3 different nonprofits, served on hospital boards, raised millions for medical research. "She sounds incredible," Margaret said. She was. And when Sarah was taken, William stopped, swallowed hard. It broke something in her. She never really recovered. Oh, she kept functioning, kept working, kept being a mother to Victoria and James. But there was always this shadow over her, this grief that never quite healed. When she was diagnosed with cancer, part of me wondered if she'd held on as long as she could, and once she knew Sarah was gone for good, she let herself stop fighting. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, and meant it. Whatever else was true, William Hartley had suffered enormously. He'd lost a granddaughter, then a wife, had spent decades in a purgatory of not knowing that must have been exquisite torture. "If you are Sarah," William said, "if the test proves what I already know in my heart, I want you to know that Catherine never stopped loving you. She talked to you every night before bed, told you about her day, imagined what you might be doing. She set a place for you at every holiday table. She never let us forget that somewhere out there was a little girl who belonged with us." Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She didn't try to stop them. "What if I'm not her, though? What if I'm just a painful reminder of everything you lost?" "You could never be that," William said. "Even if the DNA says you're not Sarah, you've given me something I haven't had in years, hope. The possibility that she's still out there. That the search isn't over." He reached out and gently wiped a tear from her cheek. "Get some sleep, Margaret. The next few days are going to be difficult no matter what the results say." After he left, Margaret stood in her apartment trying to ground herself in the familiar. The Murphy bed against the wall, the kitchenette with its 2 burners, the single window with its view of the alley. This was her life. This was who she was. Except maybe it wasn't. Maybe her real life had been waiting all these years in a mansion in Hillcrest, in a family that had never stopped searching, in an identity stolen before she was old enough to remember. She pulled out her phone and found herself scrolling through old photos of her mother. Rebecca at Margaret's high school graduation, proud and beaming despite the stage 4 cancer already spreading through her body. Rebecca in a rare moment of joy, laughing at something Margaret couldn't remember. Rebecca in the hospital during her final weeks. Frail and fading but still managing to smile when Margaret walked into the room. "Who were you?" Margaret whispered to the photographs. "Who were you really?" Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Victoria. Just checking in. How did dinner go?" Margaret typed back, "Fine. Overwhelming. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel." The response came quickly. "There's no supposed to. Feel what you feel. And remember, you don't owe my father anything. Not your time, not your identity, not your life. What if I want to give it?" Margaret typed, then deleted before sending. Instead she wrote, "Thank you for caring. Even though we don't know each other. If you're Sarah, we do know each other. I used to sing to you, 'Twinkle, twinkle, little star.' You liked it when I did the hand motions." Margaret stared at that message for a long time. Somewhere in her earliest, haziest memories was a song. A woman's voice singing, hands making shapes like stars. She'd always thought it was her mother, Rebecca. But what if it wasn't? Margaret spent the next day in a fog. She called in sick to the diner, the first time she'd done so in 3 years. Rick sounded annoyed but not surprised, as if he'd been expecting her to flake out eventually. It didn't matter. Nothing seemed to matter except the waiting, the excruciating passage of hours until the DNA results came back. She tried to distract herself with online coursework but couldn't focus on accounting principles when her entire identity might be a fabrication. She tried cleaning her apartment but kept stopping to stare at objects. A coffee mug, a photograph, a book, and wondering if they'd still have meaning if she turned out to be someone else entirely. Around noon, Danny texted, "Rick says you're sick. You okay? Need anything?" "Just a stomach bug," Margaret lied. "I'll be fine in a day or two. Let me know if you need soup or whatever. Mom makes good soup." His kindness made her want to cry. What would Danny think if he knew the truth? Would he still see her as Maggie, his coworker and friend? Or would she become something else in his eyes? Sarah Hartley, the stolen heiress, a story from the news rather than a person? Late afternoon, her phone rang. "William." "They rushed the results," he said without preamble. His voice was shaking. "Margaret, they rushed the results. We can go to the lab right now and get them." Margaret's heart began hammering in her chest. "Right now? But you said 48 hours. I paid them to expedite. I needed to know. Margaret, please, come with me to get the results. Whatever they say, I want us to hear them together." She should have said no. Should have insisted on the full waiting period, on time to prepare herself mentally and emotionally. But Margaret was tired of waiting, tired of uncertainty. She wanted to know, needed to know, even if the knowing destroyed everything she'd believed about her life. "Give me 30 minutes, she said. "I'll meet you there." The medical facility felt different this time. Colder, more sterile. The receptionist who'd been friendly during their first visit now wore a professional mask, her expression neutral as she directed them to a private consultation room. A doctor, Dr. Patricia Williams, according to her name tag, was waiting for them with a manila folder that seemed far too thin to contain life-altering information. "Mr. Hartley, Ms. Chen," she greeted them. "Please sit down." Margaret sat. Her hands were numb. The room felt too bright, too small, like a cage disguised as a professional office. "I have your results," Dr. Williams said. She looked at Margaret, then at William, her expression carefully neutral. "Before I share them, I want to prepare you both. DNA testing for kinship is very reliable, but the results can be emotionally complex. Are you ready?" "Yes," William said. "No," Margaret said simultaneously. Dr. Williams gave her a sympathetic look. "Take your time." Margaret took a breath, then another. Then, "Okay, tell us." Dr. Williams opened the folder. Based on the DNA samples provided, Dr. Williams looked up from the folder. "Mr. Hartley, the DNA analysis confirms with 99.9% certainty that Margaret Chen is your biological granddaughter. She is Sarah Catherine Hartley." William collapsed, clutching his chest. Margaret screamed for help as paramedics rushed in. At the hospital, William survived barely. Through tears, he whispered, "Welcome home, Sarah. Margaret stood at the crossroads of two lives. She was both Margaret Chen, daughter of a woman who'd loved her desperately enough to steal her, and Sarah Hartley, the missing heiress who'd finally been found. Some truths don't heal. They just reveal deeper questions about love, identity, and forgiveness. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.